Every day the world loses legends, icons whose lives shaped our culture, our memories, our hearts. From actors to musicians, pioneers to visionaries, their stories deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Welcome back. Here we honor the lives, achievements, and legacies of those who passed, today keeping their memory alive for generations to come. The news arrived quietly, almost like a soft note fading into silence. In Israel, where much of her later life unfolded, the passing of Suki Lahav was confirmed with a sense of deep, reflective sorrow. For many, her name carried a quiet recognition. But for those who truly followed her journey, it raised a lingering question. How did one artist manage to leave such a gentle yet lasting mark across two very different worlds? There was no loud farewell. No grand announcement. Just a stillness that seemed to settle over the spaces she once filled with music and words. And in that stillness, another question emerged. Was her story ever fully told? Long before she became a respected voice in Israel's cultural scene, Suki Lahav stood on international stages as part of the legendary E Street Band. It was a time filled with movement, sound, and energy. As a violinist, her presence added something unique, something subtle yet deeply felt. She was not always at the center of attention, but her contribution shaped the emotional texture of the music in ways that many would only understand years later. A former bandmate once reflected, "She didn't need to be loud to be heard. Her music spoke in a different way, and people felt it." That quiet strength would become a defining part of her life. But even during those vibrant years, there were signs that her path would not remain in one place. Behind the performances and applause, there was a creative spirit searching for something deeper. What was she really looking for? And why did she eventually step away from such a globally recognized stage? The answer began to unfold when she returned to Israel. A decision that surprised many at the time. For some, it seemed like stepping away from fame. But for Suki Lahav, it was a return to something more personal, more meaningful. It was here that her story took a quieter yet richer turn. In Israel, she did not simply continue as a musician. She evolved. She became a writer, a storyteller, and a voice that carried emotion through both language and sound. Her work reflected identity, memory, and the delicate space between cultures. It was no longer about performing for crowds. It was about connecting with individuals. A reader once shared in a tribute, "Her words felt like music. You didn't just read them, you experienced them." It was a rare gift, the ability to move between art forms without losing depth in either. As the years passed, her presence in public life remained gentle but steady. She was respected not for constant visibility, but for the sincerity of her work. There were no dramatic headlines, no controversies, only a consistent dedication to creativity and expression. And yet, as news of her passing spread, something unexpected happened. People began revisiting her work. Old performances resurfaced. Passages from her writing were shared again. It was as if her voice, though quiet, had been waiting to be heard once more. A cultural commentator in Israel wrote, "She built bridges without ever asking for attention. Between music and literature, between places and people. Her legacy lives in those connections." It was a simple observation, but one that captured the essence of her life. There is often a moment when reflecting on someone like Suki Lahav, where the story feels incomplete. Not because something is missing, but because her impact was never meant to be loud or final. It was meant to unfold slowly across time, through those who continue to discover her work. Her journey, from international stages to intimate storytelling, was not a departure but a transformation. And perhaps that is what makes her story so quietly powerful. Now, as the world pauses to remember her, one thought lingers gently in the background. How many lives did she touch without ever knowing? In the end, Suki Lahav leaves behind more than music or writing. She leaves behind a feeling, a reminder that art does not always need to demand attention to be meaningful. Sometimes the softest voices carry the deepest echoes. And somewhere in the spaces between sound and silence, her story continues to be heard. The news was confirmed in a quiet, almost understated way. In the United Kingdom, where his voice once blended into some of the most memorable harmonies of a generation, the passing of Tony Rivers brought a gentle wave of reflection. For many, his name may not have stood at the front of the stage, but his voice was always there. And that raises a quiet question: how many songs did he help shape without people ever realizing? There was no sudden noise around his passing. Just a soft recognition shared among musicians, listeners, and those who remembered a certain sound, a certain feeling. Another question slowly followed: what is the true measure of an artist? Is it fame or the lasting echo of their work? Tony Rivers was born Douglas Anthony Thompson, and from an early age, music was not just a passion, it was a language. In small studios and rehearsal rooms, long before wider recognition, he was already refining a voice that carried warmth and precision. It was not overpowering. It did not demand attention. But it stayed with people. As the 1960s and 70s unfolded, he became closely linked with harmony-driven pop music in Britain. Through his work with Harmony Grass, his voice helped create songs that felt both gentle and uplifting. Their music was not built on intensity, but on balance, voices weaving together in a way that felt almost effortless. A fellow musician once said, "Tony understood harmony like few others. He didn't try to stand above the music. He became part of it." That quiet understanding would define much of his career. But his journey did not remain within one group. Behind the scenes, his voice began to travel further. He worked alongside artists whose names would become globally recognized. Among them were Cliff Richard and Roger Daltrey. Yet even in those collaborations, Tony Rivers remained what he had always been: a steady, shaping presence rather than a spotlight figure. There is something deeply human in that kind of path. To contribute so much and yet remain almost invisible to the wider world. Why did he choose that road? Or perhaps it was simply who he was. In recording studios, often late into the evening, his voice would layer into tracks that would later reach millions. Listeners would hear the final song polished and complete, without knowing how many voices, how many careful moments had gone into its creation. Tony Rivers was part of that unseen craft. A producer who worked with him once recalled, "You could always trust Tony. When he stepped up to the mic, you knew the song would feel right." It was not about perfection. It was about emotion, about finding the exact tone that a moment needed. As years passed, the music industry changed. Sounds evolved. New styles emerged. But the work Tony Rivers had been part of did not fade. It remained, quietly playing on radios, in collections, in memories. Songs built on harmony have a way of lasting, perhaps because they reflect something deeper about connection itself. And then, as news of his passing spread, there was a subtle shift. People began to look back, not just at the songs but at the names behind them. His contributions, once in the background, came gently into focus. On social media, one tribute read, "His voice was part of the soundtrack of our lives, even if we didn't always know his name." It was a simple message, but it carried a powerful truth. Another listener shared, "There was something comforting in those harmonies. Now, knowing he was part of them, it feels personal." These reflections revealed something that statistics or charts never could: the emotional reach of his work. There is a quiet beauty in a life like Tony Rivers. He did not chase the loudest moments. He did not build his legacy on visibility. Instead, he gave his voice to something collective, something shared. And perhaps that is why his passing feels different. It is not just the loss of a singer. It is the closing of a chapter in a style of music that valued unity over individuality. A time when voices came together rather than standing apart. As the music continues to play, as those harmonies still drift through speakers and memories, his presence remains within them. Not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that quietly supports everything around it. In the end, Tony Rivers leaves behind more than recordings. He leaves behind a feeling. A reminder that sometimes, the most important voices are the ones that choose not to stand alone. And as listeners return to those familiar songs, perhaps with new understanding, one gentle thought lingers: how many other voices like his are still waiting to be truly heard? The news was delivered with a quiet sense of finality. In homes across the world where his face had once been a familiar presence on television screens, the passing of Richard Chamberlain stirred a deep and reflective silence. For many he was more than an actor. He was a constant. And now, a gentle question lingers. What happens when a presence that once felt timeless is suddenly gone? There was no single moment that defined his career. Instead, there was a steady unfolding, a life shaped by roles that carried emotion, dignity, and depth. But how did he become the figure so many came to trust on screen? And what was it about his performances that made them feel so personal? Long before he became known as the king of television drama, Richard Chamberlain was a young actor searching for direction. In the early years, there were auditions, small opportunities, and moments of uncertainty. Yet even then, there was something distinct about him. A quiet intensity, a calm confidence that did not need to be forced. His breakthrough came with the television series Dr. Kildare. Week after week, audiences watched as he portrayed a compassionate young doctor, balancing professionalism with human emotion. It was not just the storyline that drew people in, it was the way he made the character feel real. A viewer once wrote, "He made you believe in kindness again." Every episode felt like a conversation, not just a show. That connection became the foundation of his legacy. But success did not stop there. As television evolved, so did Richard Chamberlain. He moved into larger productions, taking on roles that demanded even greater emotional depth. In miniseries like The Thornbirds, he delivered performances that were both powerful and restrained. There was a certain elegance in the way he carried each role. He did not rely on loud expressions or dramatic gestures. Instead, he allowed emotion to unfold naturally. A glance, a pause, a quiet line, these became his tools. A fellow actor once shared, "Richard didn't act for attention. He acted for truth." And that's why people believed him. It was a simple observation, yet it revealed something essential about his craft. As the years passed, his career extended beyond television. He appeared in films, theater productions, and continued to explore new characters. Yet for many, it was his presence on television that remained most memorable. It was where audiences felt closest to him. There is something unique about television actors. They enter homes regularly. They become part of everyday life. And over time they begin to feel like someone familiar, someone known. Richard Chamberlain held that place for decades. But behind the success and recognition, there was also a personal journey, one that he chose to share more openly later in life. His reflections on identity and self-acceptance added another layer to his story. It was no longer just about the roles he played but about the person he became. A fan once wrote online, "He taught us more than acting. He showed us courage in being ourselves." It was a quiet tribute, but one that carried lasting meaning. When news of his passing began to spread, there was no sudden wave of noise. Instead, there was a gradual return to memory. Old scenes were revisited. Familiar moments replayed. It was as if people were gently saying goodbye in their own way. There is a certain stillness that comes when a life like his reaches its end. Not because everything has been said, but because so much was already felt. Richard Chamberlain's career spanned more than 6 decades, but numbers alone cannot define what he gave to audiences. His work carried emotion across time. It connected generations. It offered comfort, reflection, and sometimes even quiet understanding. And now, as the screen fades on his remarkable journey, another thought begins to form. What remains after the final performance? Perhaps it is not just the roles or the awards or the recognition. Perhaps it is the feeling he left behind. The sense that storytelling, when done with honesty and care, can truly touch lives. In the end, Richard Chamberlain leaves behind more than a legacy of performances. He leaves behind moments, small, meaningful, unforgettable moments that continue to live on in the hearts of those who watched him. And somewhere in the quiet glow of a television screen playing an old scene, his presence lingers, gentle, steady, and still deeply felt.